Eleanor Brooks was already awake when the front door of the Manhattan penthouse opened at 5:42 a.m. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was still dark, the skyline muted and indifferent, like it had seen this moment 1,000 times before. She sat at the kitchen island, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Victor Hale stepped inside quietly, shoes in hand, suit jacket slung over his shoulder. He smelled like expensive whiskey and a woman who wasn't her. He froze for half a second when he saw Eleanor, then smiled the practiced smile that had closed billion-dollar deals and ended countless uncomfortable conversations. "You're up early," he said lightly. Eleanor didn't answer. Her eyes weren't on him. They were on the vase in the center of the marble table. White roses, perfectly arranged, no card. Victor followed her gaze and exhaled, as if relieved. "I didn't want to wake you," he said. "Thought I'd do something nice." For a moment, Eleanor almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she stood, walked slowly to the table, and touched one of the petals. It was fresh. Too fresh. She had spent years in corporate communications before she disappeared into Victor's shadow. Years managing events, vendors, timing. She knew flowers, she knew florists, she knew delivery schedules. "These are beautiful," she said calmly. Victor relaxed. "I know you like white." "I do," Eleanor replied, "especially when they're delivered on time." The silence stretched. Victor frowned. "What does that mean?" Eleanor turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just tired." She walked past him, brushing his arm, and headed toward the bedroom. Victor stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the flowers he thought would save him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that Eleanor had already checked the building's delivery log on her phone while he was upstairs showering. The flowers hadn't arrived that morning. They had arrived at 9:58 p.m., hours before he ever came home. And in that quiet gap between delivery and arrival, Eleanor understood something that would change everything. The flowers weren't an apology. They were an alibi. And Eleanor realized her marriage hadn't just been betrayed, it had been carefully staged. Eleanor didn't sleep that morning. She lay on the edge of the bed, listening to the shower run, counting the seconds like she used to count media slots and press windows in another life. Victor hummed faintly behind the bathroom door, relaxed now, confident his performance had landed. Flowers. Silence. No confrontation. In his world, that meant victory. When the water stopped, Eleanor rose and walked into the dressing room. The space was vast, custom-built, lit softly like a luxury boutique. Rows of designer suits lined Victor's side. Her side looked full at first glance, but she knew the truth. Nothing here belonged to her in any way that mattered. The penthouse wasn't hers. The accounts weren't hers. Even the contacts in her phone had thinned over the years, names fading into polite distance once she stopped working. She had stepped away from her career 9 years ago, just for a while, Victor had said, just until things stabilized, just until he needed her less. She had believed him. Eleanor touched a navy blazer she hadn't worn in nearly a decade. Back then, she had been someone people listened to. She shaped narratives, softened scandals, saved reputations. Now, in Victor's social circle, she was introduced with a smile that always sounded the same. "This is Eleanor. She doesn't work anymore." Days for, as if it were a medical condition. At breakfast, Victor was all charm again. He scrolled through emails on his phone, mentioned a late meeting, asked casually if she planned to do anything today. Eleanor nodded, non-committal, the way she always did. There was no point reminding him that once she had managed days that moved markets. After he left, the apartment fell silent. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, staring at the flowers again. Without Victor's presence, they looked different. Less romantic, more calculated. She sat down with her laptop and opened a blank document. Her fingers hovered over the keys, then froze. For the first time, panic rose in her chest. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy. What if she really had nothing? No leverage, no proof. No one who would take her seriously. Victor had spent years making sure of that. She closed the laptop and pressed her palms against the counter, breathing slowly. She wasn't stupid, she wasn't fragile, but she was isolated, and isolation was dangerous. Victor didn't need to destroy her publicly. All he had to do was let her fade. From the outside, she was still a woman with a beautiful home and a powerful husband. From the inside, she was standing on empty ground, and that was when Eleanor understood the second truth, colder than the first. Victor didn't just betray her. He had been preparing to leave her with nothing, and he had a head start. Victor didn't confront Eleanor right away. That was his first move. Instead, he became softer, kinder, almost attentive in a way that felt unfamiliar after years of emotional distance. He asked how she was sleeping. He suggested dinner reservations. He even touched her shoulder in passing, a gesture so carefully casual it felt rehearsed. Eleanor noticed everything. On the third night after the flowers, Victor poured them both a glass of wine and sat across from her in the living room, the Manhattan skyline glowing behind him like a controlled backdrop. He didn't mention the other woman. He didn't mention the flowers. He mentioned her. "You've seemed tense lately," he said gently. "I'm worried about you." Eleanor met his eyes. "Worried how?" Victor sighed, the sound heavy with concern. "You've been forgetting things, small details. You jump to conclusions." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "After everything you went through a few years ago, I just want to make sure you're okay." There it was. Not an accusation. A suggestion. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Years ago, after her breakdown, Victor had been supportive in public and quietly strategic in private. He knew the language. He knew how to make concern sound like fact. "I didn't forget anything," Eleanor said calmly. Victor smiled, but his eyes stayed sharp. "I didn't say you did." The conversation ended there, but the message lingered. The next morning, Victor mentioned her old therapist in passing. Later that week, he asked if she'd been taking her medication regularly. Always gentle. Always reasonable. Always just loud enough to plant doubt. At lunch with friends, Victor laughed lightly and said, "Eleanor's been under a lot of stress lately. I worry she puts too much pressure on herself." The women nodded sympathetically, glancing at Eleanor with softened expressions. She realized what he was doing. Victor wasn't trying to win an argument. He was reframing reality. Slowly, methodically, he was positioning her as unreliable, emotional, unstable. And the most dangerous part was how believable it sounded. That night, Eleanor stood in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. She looked the same, calm, put together. But she felt the old fear stir, the one that whispered, maybe she was wrong, maybe she was imagining things. She clenched the sink until her knuckles whitened. This was Victor's true talent. Not money, not power, control. He didn't need proof. He only needed time and repetition. Eleanor returned to bed and lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing. She understood now that the flowers had never been the real weapon. This was. And if she didn't outthink him soon, Victor wouldn't just leave her, he would make sure no one believed her when he did. Victor chose the timing carefully. It happened at dinner, 2 nights later, with guests present. Not strangers, but people. Eleanor had known for years, a couple from Victor's firm, a woman from a charity board, her husband, all seated around the long dining table with wine already flowing. The mood was warm, polished, safe. That was why it worked. Eleanor was explaining a minor renovation issue in the building when Victor interrupted her with a soft laugh. "She's been a little scattered lately," he said, shaking his head affectionately. "You remember how it gets when stress piles up." Eleanor stopped mid-sentence. The woman across from her tilted her head. "Scattered how?" Victor waved it off. "Oh, nothing serious. Just forgetting details, misreading situations." He glanced at Eleanor, his voice lowering with concern. "Her doctor warned us this could happen again if she's not careful." Again. The word landed like a quiet bomb. Eleanor felt heat rush to her face, but she forced a smile. "Victor." He gently placed a hand over hers. "It's okay," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't have to pretend with friends." The conversation shifted after that, but Eleanor felt the shift in the room. People spoke to her more slowly, carefully. One woman asked if she was taking time to rest. Another suggested meditation, her tone pitying. By dessert, Eleanor barely tasted anything. After the guests left, Eleanor followed Victor into his study and closed the door behind them. Her voice was steady, but only because she forced it to be. "You had no right to say that." Victor leaned against the desk, calm, unbothered. "Say what?" "You implied I'm unstable." "I implied you've been under stress," he corrected. Which is true. You brought up my diagnosis. Was why gangration does. Victor's expression softened. I was protecting you. From what? Eleanor asked. From yourself, he said quietly. That was the moment she saw it clearly. Victor wasn't reacting anymore. He was executing a plan. He had just played his strongest card, and he'd done it in front of witnesses. You can't do that again, Eleanor said. Victor smiled, slow and patient. I don't think you're in a position to tell me what I can and can't do. She left the room without another word. Later that night, Eleanor sat alone on the edge of the bed, her phone in her hand. She scrolled through old messages, old contacts, people she hadn't spoken to in years. She realized how few of them would take her side if Victor decided to move forward. That was his advantage. And now, he knew it. Because Victor hadn't just questioned her sanity, he had planted doubt in the only place that mattered, other people's minds. Eleanor first noticed Sienna Moore at a charity luncheon 3 days later. The room was bright, polished, full of women who smiled with their teeth and listened with half their attention. Sienna stood out not because she was loud, but because she wasn't. She moved slowly, deliberately, dressed in understated luxury that didn't beg to be noticed. Sienna's eyes found Eleanor almost immediately. There was no smirk, no challenge, just curiosity, sharp and measuring. Victor introduced them like it was nothing. Eleanor, this is Sienna. She's been helping us with brand positioning. Us. The word slid in smoothly, as if it had always belonged there. Lovely to meet you, Sienna said, her voice calm, controlled. Likewise, Eleanor replied. Their handshake lingered half a second longer than polite. Eleanor felt it then, a quiet certainty. This woman wasn't here by accident. Over lunch, Sienna spoke little but listened to everything. She laughed at Victor's stories, at exactly the right moments. She never touched him, never leaned in too close. From the outside, she looked harmless, professional, temporary. Eleanor knew better. When Victor stepped away to take a call, Sienna turned slightly in her chair. You have beautiful taste, she said softly. The apartment, it feels intentional. Eleanor held her gaze. It used to be. Sienna smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Change is uncomfortable, she said, but sometimes necessary. There it was. Not an insult, not a threat, an assessment. Sienna wasn't pretending to replace Eleanor. She was evaluating how difficult it would be. That night, Eleanor replayed the encounter again and again. Sienna hadn't overplayed her hand. She hadn't claimed Victor. She hadn't tried to humiliate Eleanor. That restraint was the most dangerous part. This wasn't an affair fueled by emotion. It was a transaction. Victor believed he was in control, that Sienna was impressed by his power, his money, his access. Eleanor saw what he couldn't. Sienna was climbing, and Victor was just one rung on the ladder. And if Eleanor stood in the way, Sienna wouldn't push her. She would step over her. Eleanor lay awake long after Victor fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, her pulse steady, her mind clear for the first time in days. She had been preparing for war with her husband. She hadn't prepared for a woman who didn't need love, didn't need promises, and didn't need permission. Eleanor understood then that surviving would require patience, misdirection, and the discipline to let her enemies believe she was already defeated, while she quietly studied every move they made next. Because Sienna Moore wasn't Victor's weakness, she was a strategist with her own endgame. The shift was subtle at first, almost polite. Eleanor noticed it in the pauses. Conversations that stopped when she approached. Invitations that never arrived but were later discussed in front of her as if she had simply forgotten. Smiles that tightened, eyes that slid away too quickly. Victor didn't announce anything. He didn't need to. The message traveled quietly, carried by implication and tone. At a gallery opening on the Upper East Side, Eleanor stood alone with a glass of champagne that remained untouched. A woman she once called weakly nodded from across the room but didn't come over. Another leaned close to Victor, laughing, her hand resting comfortably on his arm. Eleanor recognized the posture immediately. Alignment. When Eleanor spoke, people listened with that careful expression reserved for fragile things. They agreed too quickly. They changed the subject faster. It was kindness sharpened into exclusion. Victor played his role perfectly. He kept a respectful distance, allowing others to draw their own conclusions. Occasionally, he would glance at Eleanor with concern, just long enough for someone else to notice. The implication was clear. He was patient. He was loyal. He was trying. By the end of the night, Eleanor felt transparent. The real blow came the following afternoon. She received a message from the charity board she had served on for 6 years. The language was warm, apologetic, vague. They thought it might be best if she took a temporary step back to focus on her well-being. They hoped she understood. She understood exactly. One by one, the structures that had once anchored her disappeared. No argument, no scandal, just removal. Victor hadn't destroyed her reputation. He had made her irrelevant. That evening, Eleanor sat on the bedroom floor, back against the bed, phone in her hand. She scrolled through contacts, hesitating before each name. Who would believe her? Who would risk standing beside a woman quietly labeled unstable? Her chest tightened, breath shallow. This was the danger point, the moment when isolation turns inward, when silence starts sounding like confirmation. She set the phone down and closed her eyes, grounding herself the way her therapist had taught her years ago. Name 5 things you can see, 4 you can feel, 3 you can hear. The exercise steadied her. Eleanor stood and walked to the mirror. The woman staring back looked tired. Yes, but not broken, not confused, not defeated. They wanted her to disappear softly. She wouldn't. But she understood now that shouting wouldn't save her. Proving innocence wouldn't work. This wasn't about truth. It was about perception. And perception could only be shifted from a position of strength. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and picked up her phone again, scrolling past familiar names to one she hadn't touched in years. Because social death wasn't the end. It was the warning. And Eleanor knew that surviving what came next would require an ally who didn't care what people believed. Eleanor met Caleb Rhodes on a Tuesday morning she almost canceled. The cafe was quiet, tucked between office towers downtown, the kind of place executives used for conversations they didn't want overheard. Eleanor arrived early, ordered black coffee, and chose a table near the window. She told herself this wasn't hope. It was information. Caleb arrived exactly on time. No smile, no small talk. He wore a plain gray coat, no visible watch, nothing that signaled status. He looked at Eleanor the way professionals look at risk. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said. Caleb nodded. "You asked for 15 minutes. That's all I need." He didn't respond. He waited. Eleanor explained quickly. The flowers, the gaslighting, the social withdrawal. She didn't dramatize. She didn't ask for sympathy. She laid out facts the way she once did in boardrooms. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took a slow sip of coffee. "You're right," he said. "You're being erased." The words were blunt, almost relieving. "Can you help me?" Eleanor asked. Caleb met her eyes. "No." The answer landed hard. He continued calmly. "Not yet. You don't need saving. You need leverage. And right now, you don't have it." Eleanor exhaled, steadying herself. "Then why did you come?" "Because Victor Hale makes the same mistakes every time," Caleb said. "He overestimates control and underestimates memory." Eleanor stiffened. "You know him." "I do," Caleb replied, "and he knows me, which is why he won't see me coming." Caleb leaned forward slightly. "Here's what I can tell you. Victor is preparing a clean exit. No scandal, no mess. You walk away for your health. He keeps everything." Eleanor felt the confirmation more than the shock. "How long do I have?" "Less than you think." Silence settled between them. Caleb stood. "If you want me involved, you don't react. You don't confront. You don't collapse." He paused. "You let him believe you're already gone." Eleanor looked up. "And then?" Caleb allowed himself the smallest smile. "Then we remind him what he forgot." He walked away without waiting for her response. Eleanor sat alone, pulse steady, fear sharpened into focus. For the first time since the flowers arrived, she wasn't alone. She was being watched by someone who understood the game. And Eleanor realized the most dangerous allies never rush in. They wait until the fall is inevitable. Eleanor waited 3 days after meeting Caleb before she touched anything Victor had left behind. On the 4th morning, when Victor flew to Chicago for what he called investor meetings, she moved through the penthouse with a calm she hadn't felt in weeks. This wasn't panic anymore. It was confirmation. She started in the study. Victor's office was immaculate, every surface intentional. Eleanor knew better than to search drawers like a desperate spouse. Victor never hid important things where emotion might lead someone to look. He hid them where routine lived. She opened the shared desktop computer. At first, there was nothing, just calendars, presentations, financial summaries she couldn't access without permissions. Then, she noticed the folder structure. One directory duplicated another, identical names, identical dates. A mirror. Eleanor clicked. Inside were drafts, emails never sent, legal outlines labeled contingency. One document stopped her breath cold. Personal transition plan. It wasn't about business, it was about her. The language was clinical, almost kind, suggested timeline, recommended messaging, notes about minimizing reputational exposure. There was a section titled Medical Context, referencing her past diagnosis, framed as concern, not accusation. Victor hadn't planned to abandon her in anger. He had planned to dissolve her. Eleanor scrolled slowly, forcing herself not to rush. There were talking points prepared for friends, for board members, for charities. Phrases like Eleanor needs space and we're prioritizing her health, repeated with slight variations. Sympathy engineered in advance. At the bottom was a draft email to a family law firm. The subject line read, "Clean exit, no contest." Eleanor closed the file and sat back, her hands steady, her heart pounding hard but controlled. This wasn't impulsive betrayal, this was logistics. She checked the metadata. The files had been created months ago. Months. While he kissed her goodnight. While he suggested vacations. While he let her believe the distance was temporary. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city. This wasn't about another woman. Sienna was a symptom, not the disease. Victor had already decided Eleanor was a liability. Caleb had been right. Victor wasn't reacting, he was executing. Eleanor returned to the computer and took photos of everything with her phone, careful not to alter a single file. She logged out exactly as she found it. By the time Victor's flight landed, she was back in the kitchen, calm, composed, invisible again. But something fundamental had shifted. She no longer wondered if she was imagining things. She no longer feared being wrong, because now she knew the truth with absolute clarity. Victor wasn't preparing to leave her someday, he was waiting for the moment she was weakest to finish the job. Eleanor waited 3 days after meeting Caleb before she touched anything Victor had left behind. On the 4th morning, when Victor flew to Chicago for what he called investor meetings, she moved through the penthouse with a calm she hadn't felt in weeks. This wasn't panic anymore, it was confirmation. She started in the study. Victor's office was immaculate, every surface intentional. Eleanor knew better than to search drawers like a desperate spouse. Victor never hid important things where emotion might lead someone to look. He hid them where routine lived. She opened the shared desktop computer. At first, there was nothing. Just calendars, presentations, financial summaries she couldn't access without permissions. Then she noticed the folder structure. One directory duplicated another. Identical names, identical dates. A mirror. Eleanor clicked. Inside were drafts. Emails never sent. Legal outlines labeled contingency. One document stopped her breath cold. Personal transition plan. It wasn't about business. It was about her. The language was clinical, almost kind, suggested timeline, recommended messaging, notes about minimizing reputational exposure. There was a section titled Medical Context, referencing her past diagnosis, framed as concern, not accusation. Victor hadn't planned to abandon her in anger. He had planned to dissolve her. Eleanor scrolled slowly, forcing herself not to rush. There were talking points prepared for friends, for board members, for charities. Phrases like Eleanor needs space and we're prioritizing her health, repeated with slight variations. Sympathy engineered in advance. At the bottom was a draft email to a family law firm. The subject line read, "Clean exit, no contest." Eleanor closed the file and sat back, her hands steady, her heart pounding hard but controlled. This wasn't impulsive betrayal, this was logistics. She checked the metadata. The files had been created months ago. Months. While he kissed her goodnight, while he suggested vacations, while he let her believe the distance was temporary. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city. This wasn't about another woman. Sienna was a symptom, not the disease. Victor had already decided Eleanor was a liability. Caleb had been right. Victor wasn't reacting, he was executing. Eleanor returned to the computer and took photos of everything with her phone, careful not to alter a single file. She logged out exactly as she found it. By the time Victor's flight landed, she was back in the kitchen, calm, composed, invisible again. But something fundamental had shifted. She no longer wondered if she was imagining things. She no longer feared being wrong, because now she knew the truth with absolute clarity. Victor wasn't preparing to leave her someday. He was waiting for the moment she was weakest to finish the job. Eleanor cried for Victor exactly once after she found the files. She waited until evening, until he returned from Chicago, carrying exhaustion and confidence in equal measure. She let the tears come quietly at first, then louder, uncontrolled, the kind that frightened people who preferred order. Victor froze, startled, then moved into position immediately. "What happened?" he asked, already sounding concerned. Eleanor shook her head, hands trembling, breath uneven. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just feel lost." And exit time. It was the first true thing she'd said to him in weeks. Victor guided her to the couch, sat close but not too close. He listened, he nodded, he didn't interrupt. He played the role of the patient husband so well it would have fooled anyone who didn't know better. "I think I need help," Eleanor said, voice breaking. "Maybe you were right. Maybe I've been pushing myself too hard." Victor's relief was almost imperceptible, but Eleanor saw it. He reached for her hand. "There's nothing wrong with admitting that," he said softly. "We'll take care of you." Care of you. Not with you. Over the next few days, Eleanor leaned into the image Victor had been building. She canceled lunches. She slept later. She mentioned headaches. She asked Victor to remind her about appointments she didn't have. Each small concession fed the narrative. Victor became attentive again, almost tender. He told people Eleanor was resting, that she needed privacy. He handled things for her. He spoke on her behalf, exactly as planned. Behind closed doors, Eleanor was wide awake. She returned to the MacBook she hadn't touched in years, opening files from her old career. Media contacts, strategy notes, crisis timelines. The skills she'd buried hadn't vanished. They had waited. She documented everything. Dates, statements, patterns, not emotional impressions, facts. She sent copies to an encrypted drive Caleb had provided without comment. When Victor suggested she start seeing her old therapist again, Eleanor agreed immediately. When he offered to manage her medications, she let him. Compliance was camouflage. Victor began moving faster. She noticed new emails arriving late at night, phone calls taken on the balcony. The trap was closing, and he believed she was already inside it. One evening, Victor kissed her forehead and said, "I'm proud of you for trusting me." Eleanor smiled weakly and said nothing. Trust was what had nearly destroyed her. Now, it would destroy him. She lay awake beside Victor, listening to his breathing, steady and untroubled. He believed the hardest part was over, that Eleanor was shrinking into the shape he needed her to be. He never considered the alternative. That breaking was a performance, and that the woman he thought was fading had never been more focused in her life. Because Eleanor wasn't losing herself, she was disappearing on purpose, and Victor was helping her do it. Sienna Moore reached out 2 days after Eleanor canceled her third public appearance. The message was short, polite, and carefully neutral. "Hope you're doing well. I thought we might talk. Just us." Eleanor stared at the screen for a full minute before replying. Of course. They met at a private lounge inside a boutique hotel, the kind with no signage and staff trained not to remember faces. Sienna arrived first. Eleanor noticed the calculation immediately. This was intentional. "Controlled territory. You look tired," Sienna said when Eleanor sat down. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I've been told." Sienna folded her hands. "I won't waste your time. Victor is preparing to move forward without you." Eleanor tilted her head. "You say that like it's news." End quote. "Doing from Warfers." Sienna's lips curved slightly. "Most women don't know. You do." There it was. Confirmation that Sienna wasn't guessing. She had access. Information, probably from Victor himself. "He believes you're stepping back," Sienna continued, "for your health. He thinks the transition will be clean." "And you?" Eleanor asked. Sienna leaned back. "I think Victor underestimates women who listen more than they speak." Eleanor studied her carefully. "What do you want?" Sienna didn't answer right away. She glanced around the room, then lowered her voice. An exit that benefits me and doesn't destroy you. The offer hung between them, polished and dangerous. I can help you land softly, Sienna said. Assets, visibility, dignity. You walk away intact. Victor moves on. Everyone wins. Everyone except the truth. Eleanor felt the temptation rise. Sienna wasn't threatening her. She wasn't mocking her. She was offering survival. But survival on Sienna's terms meant becoming part of the lie. You're very confident, Eleanor said quietly. Sienna smiled. Because I know how this ends, if you fight him alone. Eleanor nodded slowly, playing her part. And what do you want in return? Sienna's eyes sharpened. Access, introductions, and silence. There it was. Not alliance. Replacement. Eleanor looked down at her hands, let them tremble slightly. I need time, she said. I'm not well. They're scalpel. Sienna's expression softened, satisfied. Of course, I understand. They stood. Sienna touched Eleanor's arm gently, almost kindly. You're smarter than he thinks, she said. Don't waste that. Eleanor watched her walk away, heels steady, posture confident. Only after Sienna disappeared did Eleanor's expression change. Because Sienna had made one critical mistake. She assumed Eleanor was choosing between Victor and survival. She never considered the possibility that Eleanor was planning something neither of them controlled. And by making her move too early, Sienna had just revealed exactly where she stood on the board. Eleanor didn't accept Sienna's offer, but she didn't reject it either. She did something far more dangerous. She allowed Sienna to believe she was considering it. For the next week, Eleanor played the role perfectly. She responded slowly to messages. She asked careful questions. She let hesitation show. To Sienna, it looked like fear. To Victor, it looked like progress. Victor noticed the change immediately. Eleanor cried less. She argued less. She deferred more. He mistook compliance for surrender, exactly as she needed him to. He began making plans out loud, speaking about what's next, as if she were already a closed chapter. That was when Eleanor moved. She met Sienna again, this time in daylight, at a quiet restaurant far from Victor's usual territory. Eleanor arrived late on purpose, eyes tired, hands unsteady. Sienna read it as weakness. I can do this, Eleanor said softly, staring at the table. But I need protection. Sienna leaned in, pleased. From Victor? Eleanor nodded. From being erased. Sienna smiled. Then we understand each other. What Sienna didn't realize was that Eleanor had already forwarded the meeting location, time, and purpose to Caleb, not for rescue, for record. Eleanor let Sienna talk. About Victor's impatience, about his future plans, about how quickly he would replace Eleanor once the narrative was complete. Sienna spoke freely, confident Eleanor was already lost. That night, Eleanor went home and did something Victor never expected. She confronted him, not with anger, with vulnerability. I spoke to Sienna, Eleanor said quietly. Victor froze. Just for a moment. She thinks I should leave, Eleanor continued. That it would be easier for everyone. I come. Victor exhaled, relieved. I just want you safe. Eleanor nodded. Then you won't mind if I get independent counsel. The air changed. Victor's tone sharpened instantly. That's unnecessary. Eleanor looked at him, steady now. Then you're afraid. Victor saw it then. Not defiance, awareness. Too late. Because in trying to control both women, Victor had exposed himself to both. And in believing Eleanor was broken, Sienna had spoken too freely. Neither realized the truth until it was unavoidable. They weren't betraying Eleanor. They were betraying each other. And Eleanor was standing exactly where the truth finally crossed paths with consequence. Caleb didn't call Eleanor. He sent a location. No explanation. No reassurance. Just an address and a time. Eleanor arrived 10 minutes early, as instructed. The building was anonymous, the kind of midtown office tower people passed without noticing. Inside, the lobby was quiet, polished, forgettable. Caleb was already there, seated at a corner table in a private conference room, a single folder placed neatly in front of him. You didn't react, he said when she entered. That was the point, Eleanor replied. Caleb nodded once. Good, because reaction would have ruined this. He slid the folder toward her but didn't open it. Victor Hale thinks control is about silence, about managing stories before they exist. He paused. That's why he never looks backward. Eleanor didn't touch the folder yet. What did he miss? Caleb leaned back. 5 years ago, Victor forced me out of a merger by feeding selective information to regulators. Nothing illegal, just enough to poison the deal. He thought I disappeared. And you didn't, Eleanor said. I documented everything, Caleb replied calmly. Patterns, timelines. His methods don't change, he just upgrades the packaging. Caleb opened the folder. Inside were charts, correspondence, internal memos. Eleanor recognized Victor's phrasing immediately, the same language he used at home. At dinner. With her. You're not his first clean exit, Caleb continued. You're just the first wife. Eleanor felt a chill move through her chest, but her voice stayed steady. Why show me this now? Because Victor made 2 mistakes, Caleb said. He underestimated your intelligence, and he assumed Sienna Moore was loyal to him. 2-1. Also. Eleanor looked up sharply. You know about her. I know about leverage, Caleb replied. Sienna wants acceleration, Victor wants containment. Those goals were never compatible. Caleb closed the folder. I can dismantle Victor's credibility in the only place that matters to him. Quietly, permanently, but only if you're prepared for what comes after. What comes after? Eleanor asked. Caleb met her eyes. Freedom without protection, no narrative handed to you, no savior standing in front. Eleanor considered that. For the first time, the fear wasn't paralyzing, it was clarifying. I don't want revenge, she said. I want him unable to do this to anyone else. Caleb allowed a faint smile. That's why this works. He stood, gathering the folder. The gala is in 10 days. Victor plans to end you there. Eleanor straightened. Then that's where it ends. Caleb nodded. Not for you. He paused at the door. For him? Thanks for watching. And in that moment, Eleanor understood the game had shifted because the man who once erased others was about to be erased himself. The gala was everything Victor Hale loved about power. Crystal chandeliers, black cars lining the curb, cameras positioned just far enough to feel exclusive, but close enough to matter. The ballroom buzzed with money, influence, and people who believed they were untouchable. Victor moved through it like a man stepping onto his own stage. Sienna arrived on his arm. She wore confidence more than jewelry, her smile trained for lenses, her posture announcing arrival without a single word. Whispers followed them immediately. Victor welcomed it. This was the moment he had planned. Not the end of a marriage, but the unveiling of a replacement. Eleanor was not on the guest list. At least, that was what Victor believed. From the balcony overlooking the ballroom, Eleanor watched the scene unfold. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't angry. She was focused. The dress she wore was simple, elegant, chosen to disappear until the exact second she didn't. No diamonds, no statement, just presence. Caleb stood a few steps behind her, silent. Once you walk down those stairs, he said quietly, there's no controlling the outcome. Eleanor nodded. I don't want to. Below, Victor raised his glass for a toast. He spoke about growth, about transitions, about difficult decisions made with compassion. Every word was carefully chosen. Every sentence nudged the audience toward one conclusion. That Eleanor Brooks had quietly stepped aside. Sienna squeezed Victor's arm, playing her role flawlessly. Then Eleanor moved. She descended the stairs slowly, calmly, visible just enough for heads to turn. The ripple spread fast. Confusion first, then recognition, then silence. Victor saw her mid-sentence. His voice caught. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Not fear, calculation scrambling. Eleanor stopped a few feet from the stage. She didn't interrupt. She waited. The pause stretched. Cameras shifted. Victor forced a smile. Eleanor, he said, as if surprised. I didn't expect you. I know, Eleanor replied evenly. That was the point. A murmur swept the room. Eleanor turned slightly, just enough to face the audience. I won't take much time, she said. I just wanted to be present for the story being told about me. Victor's jaw tightened. Because, Eleanor continued, it's interesting how easy it is to rewrite someone's life when you think they won't speak. Caleb stepped forward then, placing a folder on the edge of the stage. Victor stared at it. And for the first time that night, he understood something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Because the gala Victor designed to erase Eleanor was about to become the place where everything he built began to collapse. For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence inside the ballroom felt heavier than any argument. Glasses hovered midair. Conversations died unfinished. Victor's smile remained frozen, stretched too thin to be real, while his mind raced to regain control. "This isn't appropriate," he said finally, his voice smooth but tight. "Eleanor, you should have told me you were coming." Eleanor didn't look at him. She looked at the room. At the faces that had quietly accepted his version of her disappearance without question. "I was told I wasn't well enough to attend public events," she said evenly. "So I thought it would be helpful for people to see me for themselves." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Victor cleared his throat. "This isn't the place for personal matters." "You made it one," Eleanor replied. Sienna's expression flickered for the first time. Not fear, calculation. She glanced at Victor, then at the folder on the stage, then back at Eleanor. The order of power was changing, and she felt it. Caleb spoke calmly from behind Eleanor. "This won't take long." Victor snapped his head toward him. "This is private business." Caleb smiled faintly. "It stopped being private when you made it performative." He opened the folder. Inside were printed communications, timelines, and summaries placed deliberately so the first page faced the audience cameras. Victor didn't need to read the details to recognize his own words. His phrasing, his methods. "You've been managing exits for years," Caleb continued. "Employees, partners, investors. Eleanor was simply the first you attempted to remove without resistance." Murmurs spread faster now. Victor stepped forward. "This is absurd." Eleanor finally turned to him. "Is it?" she asked quietly. "Because you prepared my departure months before I ever confronted you." Her voice didn't shake. "That unsettled people more than anger would have. You told them I needed rest," she said, gesturing gently to the room. "You told them I was fragile. You told them I agreed." She paused. "I didn't." Sienna took a step back, subtly distancing herself from Victor's side. Victor's confidence faltered, just slightly. "Enough. This is manipulation," he said. "From someone who isn't well." The accusation hung in the air. Eleanor smiled sadly. "You've said that so often, it almost sounds true." Caleb closed the folder. "What's true is that your credibility ends tonight." Victor's eyes darkened. He saw it then, the shift he could no longer stop. Not because Eleanor had shouted, but because she had stood exactly where she wasn't supposed to be. Visible, calm, impossible to dismiss. And Victor realized too late that the woman he tried to erase had returned as the one person he could no longer control. Victor tried to speak, but the room had already moved past him. That was the moment power actually shifted, not when accusations were made, but when attention withdrew. Phones were no longer pointed at Eleanor, they were pointed at him. A board member stepped closer to the stage, asking a quiet question Victor couldn't ignore. Another followed, then another. The language changed from social to procedural, from sympathy to liability. Victor felt it closing in, the way a market turns before a crash. "This is being taken out of context," Victor said sharply. "Private documents, personal matters." Caleb answered before Eleanor could. "They're operational patterns," he said, "and they're consistent." He signaled subtly. Screens at the edges of the ballroom lit up, displaying neutral summaries, not accusations. Timelines. Repeated exits. Carefully phrased recommendations. No emotion. Just math. Victor's partners exchanged looks. They didn't need drama. They needed distance. Sienna finally stepped away from Victor's side completely. It wasn't dramatic. She simply removed her hand, adjusted her posture, and became a separate figure. Cameras caught it immediately. The image would travel faster than any statement, Victor noticed. His voice tightened. "Sienna." She didn't look back. Eleanor watched quietly. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence, unfolding exactly as Caleb promised. Victor wasn't being attacked. He was being assessed. An assessment was fatal. A senior investor leaned toward another and whispered. Eleanor didn't hear the words, but she recognized the effect. The man nodded once. Decision made. Victor raised his voice. "This is ridiculous. I built this firm." "And now," Eleanor said calmly, "you're the risk it can't afford." The words landed cleanly. No anger, no triumph. Security appeared at the edge of the room, not to remove Victor, but to manage the crowd. That distinction mattered. He wasn't being punished, he was being contained. Victor looked at Eleanor then, truly looked, and for the first time understood the scale of what he'd lost. Not money, not reputation. Control. As the gala dissolved into quiet chaos, Eleanor stepped back from the stage. Caleb moved beside her, unobtrusive. Together, they disappeared the same way Victor once erased others without noise, without spectacle. Somewhere near the exit, a reporter asked a question no one answered. Silence followed, heavier than denial. Victor opened his mouth again, then stopped. He finally understood that explanations were useless now. In rooms like this, truth didn't matter. Confidence did. And his was gone tonight. Behind them, Victor Hale stood alone, surrounded by people who no longer needed him. And in the space of one public evening, the man who orchestrated clean exits became one himself. Sienna Moore left the ballroom before Victor did. That alone told the story. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone who understood when a position had become unsalvageable. Cameras caught her departure within minutes, the narrative already rewriting itself without her consent. By morning, the headlines were careful but sharp. Questions about Victor's leadership, concerns about governance, and quietly, subtly, Sienna's name disappeared from every article that mattered. Victor called her 3 times before noon. She didn't answer. When they finally met 2 days later, it wasn't in a hotel lounge or a restaurant with privacy agreements. It was in a plain office with glass walls, rented by the hour. Sienna arrived 10 minutes late on purpose. This wasn't the deal, Victor said the moment she sat down. Sienna removed her coat slowly. No, she replied. This was always the deal. You said you would stand with me, Victor snapped. I said I would stand where power was, she corrected. You confused the two. I was master. Victor stared at her, stunned by how quickly admiration had turned into distance. You used me. Sienna didn't deny it. You offered yourself. She leaned forward. You promised access, acceleration, insulation. You failed on all 3. Victor's voice dropped. You think you'll walk away clean? Sienna smiled, small and cold. Cleaner than you. She stood, gathering her things. You taught me something valuable, she added. Never tie yourself to someone who believes control is permanent. That was the last conversation they ever had. Within weeks, Sienna's contracts dissolved. Invitations stopped coming. Brands stopped returning calls. No scandal followed her. No dramatic fall. Just absence. The kind that told people she was no longer useful. She had built her ascent on proximity to power. And when that power collapsed, she had nothing underneath it. Eleanor heard about Sienna's disappearance secondhand, through whispers that never quite reached her directly. She didn't feel satisfaction, just clarity. Sienna hadn't been evil, she had been efficient. And efficiency without loyalty always demanded a price. Meanwhile, Victor's world continued to shrink. Meetings postponed, calls unanswered, lawyers replaced by silence. He had lost more than his firm. He had lost relevance. Eleanor watched it all from a distance. She chose. She didn't need to push. The system Victor trusted was doing the work for her. Because the final punishment wasn't humiliation, it was being forgotten. And for people like Victor Hale and Sienna Moore, that was the one consequence they could never recover from. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning, without raised voices or photographers waiting outside. Eleanor signed the papers in a neutral office that smelled faintly of toner and lemon cleaner, the kind of place designed to drain emotion from important decisions. Victor sat across from her. Thinner somehow, his confidence reduced to politeness. He tried once. You didn't have to do it this way, he said quietly. Eleanor met his eyes. This is the way you chose. The terms were clean. No public accusations. No courtroom spectacle. Eleanor took what was legally hers and nothing more. Victor kept the properties, the titles, the shell of a life that no longer protected him. It wasn't mercy. It was precision. Outside, Victor lingered. You could have destroyed me, he said. I didn't need to, Eleanor replied. You built a system that does that on its own. He nodded, finally understanding. There would be no reconciliation, no apology that mattered. Eleanor walked away alone. By design? Over the next weeks, Victor attempted what he always had. Control through proximity. Emails framed as concern, messages offering help, introductions he could no longer make. Eleanor declined, each with brief, courteous responses. Distance was the boundary he couldn't cross. Caleb checked in once, only once. "You're free," he said. "I know," Eleanor replied. Freedom felt quieter than she expected. No triumph, no bitterness, just space. She moved out of the penthouse into a smaller apartment with morning light and windows she could open herself. She bought furniture she chose, paid for with accounts in her own name. Each receipt felt like proof. Victor, meanwhile, faded. Invitations stopped. Boards replaced him without comment. His name became a cautionary footnote, mentioned carefully, then not at all. He learned what Eleanor already knew. Power doesn't fall loudly, it dissolves. Months later, Victor sent one last message. Not a plea, a statement. "I underestimated you." Eleanor read it, then deleted it without replying. The divorce had taken Victor's authority, his narrative, his certainty. It left him intact enough to live with the consequences. And it gave Eleanor something better than revenge. It gave her an ending without blood, and a beginning that belonged entirely to her. She slept better after that, not because the past was healed, but because it was finished. Each morning brought ordinary choices: coffee, work, silence that no one could negotiate away. Eleanor began consulting again, quietly, on her terms, choosing clients who valued clarity over cruelty. The life ahead wasn't loud or dramatic, it was stable. And stability, she learned, was the rarest victory of all. It felt earned, deliberate, and finally safe. She did not look back. There was nothing there for her anymore now. Eleanor left Manhattan without announcing it. There was no farewell dinner, no final walk through familiar streets, no dramatic closing of doors. One morning, she loaded 2 suitcases into a hired car and watched the city recede through the window like a chapter that had already ended. She felt no sadness, only relief. Her new home was smaller, quieter, tucked into a coastal town where mornings smelled like salt and coffee instead of ambition. The apartment faced the water. Nothing about it impressed anyone, and that was exactly why she chose it. No one here knew Victor Hale's name. No one cared what Eleanor Brooks used to be. Healing did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, sleeping through the night for the first time in years, cooking meals without checking the clock, walking without feeling watched. The absence of tension was so unfamiliar it felt almost suspicious at first, like waiting for a noise that never came. Eleanor started therapy again, not because she was broken, but because she was honest enough to know survival left marks. She spoke about control, about silence, about how easily love becomes leverage when power enters the room. Her therapist listened without labels, without pity. That mattered. She returned to work slowly, consulting projects at first, remote, selective, companies that needed clarity, not spin, leaders who understood boundaries. Eleanor discovered her instincts were sharper now, her tolerance for manipulation non-existent. She trusted herself again. Caleb visited once, months later, not as a strategist, just as a man who respected distance. "You look lighter," he said. "I am," Eleanor replied. They walked along the shore, speaking about nothing urgent. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He didn't frame the past as a lesson. He let it be what it was. That, too, mattered. News from the city reached Eleanor occasionally, carried by mutual acquaintances who spoke carefully, as if mentioning Victor might reopen wounds. She learned he had moved again, that he consulted occasionally, that his influence never fully returned. She felt no satisfaction, just closure. One evening, Eleanor sat on her balcony as the sun dipped into the water, her phone buzzing beside her with a message from a new client. She accepted the project, set the terms, closed the app. For the first time in a long while, her life felt quiet without being empty. Healing, she realized, wasn't about becoming who she used to be. It was about becoming someone Victor could never have controlled. And as the sky darkened and the lights along the shore flickered on, Eleanor understood that this quiet wasn't temporary. It was home. Eleanor didn't fall in love the way she used to. There was no rush this time. No surrender disguised as romance. No quiet shrinking to make space for someone else's certainty. What grew between her and Caleb was slower, steadier, and grounded in something Eleanor had never experienced before: choice. They stayed in touch after his visit, exchanging messages that carried no urgency. Some days passed without communication at all, and neither felt the need to fill the silence. When Caleb visited again, months later, it wasn't because Eleanor needed support. It was because they both wanted company. He stayed in a small hotel near the harbor, never assuming access to her space. They cooked together, walked along the water, spoke about work, books, weather, nothing loaded. Eleanor noticed how easily she breathed around him, how her body didn't brace for impact. One evening, as they sat on her balcony watching the tide pull in, Caleb spoke quietly. "I don't want to be the man who found you when you were broken." Eleanor turned to him. "I wasn't broken," she said. "I was cornered." End quote. He nodded. "Then I don't want to be the man who saves you." She smiled. "Good. I don't need one." That was the moment something settled between them. Their relationship didn't erase the past. It didn't redeem it. It existed alongside it, respectful of the distance Eleanor needed. Caleb never rushed her healing. He never asked her to explain Victor or justify her caution. When she pulled away, he didn't chase. When she stepped closer, he didn't take more than she offered. Eleanor realized that was what safety felt like. Months passed. Their lives intertwined naturally. Work trips overlapped. Friends met without ceremony. There were disagreements, of course, but no punishment followed them. No withdrawal. No silence weaponized. One morning, Eleanor woke to sunlight and the sound of Caleb making coffee in her kitchen. Not as a guest, not as a fixture, just as someone who belonged in the moment. "I've never lived like this," she admitted. Caleb handed her a mug. "Neither have I." Love, Eleanor learned, wasn't intensity. It was consistency. It was knowing that if she spoke, she would be heard, and if she didn't, she wouldn't be erased. It was partnership without hierarchy, affection without leverage. For the first time in her life, Eleanor wasn't loved for her usefulness, her patience, or her silence. She was loved for her presence, and that made all the difference. Eleanor's wedding was nothing like her first. There were no chandeliers, no guest list curated for influence, no speeches about legacy or power. The ceremony took place on a quiet stretch of coastline just outside town, where the water met the sand without asking permission. Fewer than 30 people attended. Everyone there knew her name for the right reasons. She wore a simple dress she chose herself, paid for with her own money, altered by a local tailor who asked questions about comfort instead of status. When Eleanor walked toward Caleb, there was no weight in her chest, no fear disguised as excitement, only steadiness. Caleb met her halfway. That, Eleanor realized, was the difference. Their vows were short, honest. They promised partnership, not possession, growth, not sacrifice. When the ceremony ended, there was laughter instead of applause, and the sound carried easily in the open air. Victor did not know, and that felt right. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the guests lingered over food and conversation, Eleanor stepped away for a moment, standing alone near the water. She thought about the woman she had been: quiet, contained, shrinking to survive. She didn't judge her. That woman had done what she needed to do. But she was done now. Caleb joined her, slipping his hand into hers. No announcement, no claim, just presence. "You okay?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "Better than okay. It's now Shinavam's no, daughter." In the months that followed, life unfolded gently. Eleanor's consulting work expanded, not explosively, but sustainably. Clients sought her out by recommendation, drawn to her clarity and refusal to manipulate. She built something steady, something that couldn't be taken from her with a signature or a rumor. Occasionally, Victor's name surfaced, usually in passing. Someone would mention a failed venture, a missed opportunity, a man who used to be important. Eleanor felt nothing sharp when she heard it. His story no longer intersected with hers. That was the true ending. One morning, Eleanor received flowers. White roses. She paused when she saw them, memory flickering, but these were different. No mystery, no performance. A card rested openly among the stems, written in a familiar hand. "Just because." Rafto. Eleanor smiled. This time, the flowers weren't proof of anything. They didn't explain or excuse. They were simply a gift, freely given, without strategy. That was her reward. Not wealth taken, not enemies destroyed, but a life rebuilt on truth, a love that didn't require her silence, and the quiet knowledge that the woman once erased now stood fully, finally, in her own name. So, the story has come to an end, and if you're still here with me right now, truly still here until this moment, then something in this story has touched your heart in a quiet but real way. Maybe it wasn't the betrayal, maybe it wasn't the revenge, maybe it was the slow realization that strength doesn't always look loud, and healing doesn't always look dramatic. What this story reminds us is simple, but powerful. You don't win by screaming your truth, you win by standing firmly in it. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Eleanor didn't control her husband's betrayal, the lies, or the cruelty. What she controlled was her response, her patience, and her decision to not disappear just because others wanted her to. Another Stoic truth says, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." And that's exactly what healing looks like here, not destruction, but clarity, not humiliation, but freedom. Real justice isn't loud, it's lasting. So, if this story resonates with you, maybe it's because you're learning the same lesson in your own life. You are not weak for choosing peace, and you are not broken for needing time. If this message speaks to you, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, not just entertain. And thank you truly for staying until the end.